Welcome, everyone. Thanks to the IT team for resolving the streaming issue. I think we're ready to go. So I'd like to welcome you to the HUD CARES Act Training Conference. This is going to be a week-long conference. It's virtual, as much of our work has been in the last couple of years. So I think we're all used to some of the functionalities of these platforms. But what I do want to say is that we want to make sure that this is as interactive as possible. So I encourage everyone out there to use, whether it's the Slido, polls, questions, functionalities, or the Brand Live chat function, which is on your lower right of your screen, to really interact with us. It's going to be a lot of content coming your way for the next week. So it's going to be key to have some information exchange between you, the audience, and us, the presenters. The conference is split into two parts. The first part of the week is focusing on some of the CPD CV programs. That includes today's session. And then the latter part of the week, we'll be presenting a virtual, basically Cdbg course. I know many of you probably have already taken a course in the past. For those of you that are newer to Cdbg, it's a great refresh. And those who are just starting, it's really an invaluable source of information for the Cdbg program. We will be putting some CV overlays into that training. So I encourage everyone to tune in. Next slide, please. I'm Madeline Fraser-Cook, and I'm with the Local Initiatives Support Corporation. I'm the Director of Government Investments and Technical Assistance, and I'm joined today by my colleagues at LISC, Doug Harsenay, who's a consultant, and all of my colleagues, please put on your video so that we could see you. Doug Harsenay, consulting for LISC, Matthew Josephs, who's our Senior Vice President for Policy, and he will be walking us through some of the Arpa housing provisions that will be useful in knowing about as you pursue your housing models in your communities. We're also joined by Matthew Lieber, who is a manager with our national housing team, and he'll be walking through a lot of the housing models with us today. So we really appreciate his participation here. And then we are also lucky to have Michael Scribatinis here, who's our Senior Vice President for Housing at LISC and brings a range of experience with all sorts of different housing development, housing finance. So we've got a strong housing bench here to present these housing models for you. Next slide, please. I'm going to start off with a few housekeeping points. So first of all of this information will be available to you on the HUD Exchange after the conference. All of you will be in listening mode only today, given the size of our audience. And as you can see, the other points in terms of the closed captioning and your resource, if you have any issues with participating, are in the resources page of the event website. Next slide, please. We're going to be interacting primarily through the Q&A and chat features, as well as the polls. So please submit any of your content-related questions in the Q&A portion of the Slido. If you kind of scroll down from this screen that you're looking at, you'll see the Slido screen below. That's where you can put some of your Q&As, and that's where you're going to be answering your polls. Next question. Next slide, please. For technical issues, please use the chat function on the Brand Live portion of this presentation. So as you can see the screenshot, it's going to be there on the lower right of your screen. And then we also have a event support email if you really need some help with troubleshooting, and the CIDEM team will assist. Next slide, Matt. So this is one of the ways that we're really going to try and get your feedback and at least kind of break up the presentation. for you. We're going to have some polls, and they're basically questions. They're multiple choice. It makes you think a little bit about what you heard. It gives you an opportunity to give some feedback. So the polls is a really important part of this interactive piece, so that we're not talking for the whole time, but we're getting some feedback from you. So the polls you can find in Slido either on your phone if you downloaded the app, or again, you scroll down your screen and you'll see the Slido plugin. You'll see that there's going to be a polls feature there, and that's as we go through the presentation, that's where you're going to be able to answer the poll questions, view and answer. Next slide. And yes, all participants will be able to get the PowerPoint. It will be loaded up onto the HUD Exchange along with the other materials from the session. We're being asked to make the screen a little bit bigger, so we can work on that. I think Matthew is going to work on that. So we'll take a minute here to figure out if we could do that. It looks like some people are having a hard time seeing it.
Matt, you'll need to share the window instead of the full screen to make it larger when you go to share this.
So we'll stop sharing and then reshare, sharing the window rather than the screen. So while Matt is working on that, what we'll do is just go over the questions and the polls. You should have gotten a participant code for this session through Slido, and this is going to be the case for all of the sessions through the week. So this is really important to kind of know and get used to. You're going to have a session code that you enter into the Slido app, and that should be able to give you access to the Slido app for the sessions that you're participating in. Next slide, please. So for the agenda for today, we're going to talk a little bit about, we're going to set the stage and talk about the impacts of COVID on affordable housing in communities. We're then going to move on to talking about the ARPA and the housing resources contained within the ARPA. And then we're going to talk through different housing models. Now, it's going to be important to know that this session is a little bit different than some of the others in that, yes, we're going to be discussing the tiebacks, which are critical to being able to use any of the CV dollars for your programs. But we're also going to be looking a little bit broader and talking through the various types of housing models that are out there. Some of them will be more conducive to using with CV, but nonetheless, we wanted to make sure that we're presenting all of the various housing options and how you can anticipate using those housing models in your program design. So I think Matt is working on sharing the screen to make it larger to respond to some folks. So Matt, in the bottom right, there's a slider that maybe you can make it a little bit bigger down there too. And then share your screen, but share your window if you share from Zoom.
I am only sharing my window. I have a 47-inch monitor, so it letterboxes the side, and I don't think I can.
So you can play.
I am only sharing the window. I have taken it out of presenter view, so it doesn't maximize. Is this changed anything? Can everybody see anything anymore?
Matt, go down one size more, and then I think we're good. You just went up one side and it cut it off a little bit. So just reverse what you just did.
And then play the slideshow. Thank you.
Does that do anything?
I could see it before, fine. It's just up to the folks that maybe had a little bit of a harder time that had commented on it. So I'm just going to keep going here. This is the first poll we have today. So we want to get a sense of who's out there in the audience. And if you could just use your Slido again, go down, scroll down a little bit and answer the poll. I'm here representing a federal, state, county, municipal, other organization or agency. And the item team, if you could show the results really quickly. We're still coming in. All right, there we go. Looks like we have an overwhelming majority coming from the municipal level. So good to know. Welcome everyone from the various municipalities out there. We're going to go back to the next question. So Matthew, if you could share your screen, we're going to the next poll. How much experience do you have with developing affordable housing in your community? I'm an old hand. I can hold my own. I'm a rookie. And we welcome all of you. So let's see who's out there. All right. So it looks like we have a lot of new people in the housing space, which is fine. This is great. We're going to walk through a variety of models and kind of give you some tips in terms of what to think about. And certainly we have some experience here. So those of you who are an old hand, please feel free to use the chat and the questions to participate, because we'd love to tap into your expertise as well. So the next slide, we're going to hand it over to Matthew, who is going to give us the big picture around COVID. So Matthew, I'm going to hand it over.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. We sincerely apologize for some folks being unable to see this deck clearly. It will be made available afterwards for participants in today's meeting. So thank you for coming. Some of what you're going to hear about COVID and housing is going to reinforce and kind of reiterate things that you already have heard. But a lot of this is worth repeating and hammering over and over again, because the crisis that we face is truly one of the largest in our country. COVID on its own, from the health perspective, is closing out on 1 million dead Americans. But beyond that, it has really brought forward the stresses of a lot of our everyday life. And that goes beyond just the supply chain, right? A lot of the stresses are showing in our communication links, in our ability to transport, and particularly in housing. The housing modalities in the United States that we're going to be talking about have already been proven challenging and hard to use in order to really push against the economic forces that are making our housing crisis worse and worse. Quality affordable housing was already the biggest challenge facing poor people in this country prior to the public health crisis of COVID. And as a lot of you may or may not know, there's a whole field of study about the social determinants of health that really points out that that housing and housing instability itself is a public health crisis. COVID is really stressing all of these forces that keep American life together, really in small cities and rural communities. You know, a lot of the media, you know, is based in larger cities. So you hear about New York, you hear about large cities across the country, but rural communities, secondary cities, tertiary cities, you know, municipalities of 50,000 and fewer, you know, they are really being decimated, especially, you know, quote unquote company towns where, you know, one industry may dominate. And if that industry gets hit with sickness, the ripple effects are felt throughout the economy, not just at the plant, but at the entire economic spectrum of things that people who aren't allowed to go out because of COVID can no longer partake in. It goes without saying that lower incomes and lower savings have forced particularly rural people to continue to work and not get the health care they need, especially when the choice is between economic devastation or you know, quarantining with what may be a symptomless or a cold-like illness, right? Juxtaposed with the economic issues that would come from not working. A lot of folks don't really have that choice as a real choice and are forced to continue working. And then, you know, we've been having the discussion about the digital divide ever since the internet was a thing. This has really borne out all of the projections that we have been seeing, which is that lack of fast, reliable internet service that has the ability to carry video and audio and stream without limitations really is a divide that, especially now in our mobile universe, has the ability to set back students and their growth and their, you know, parents and their economic prospects simultaneously. Just to go a little bit deeper into the very specifics of why that is, on the right-hand side of this slide, you will see a timeline or a kind of a movement of folks through a cycle of crisis of a household losing their income, landlords becoming unable or unwilling to pay municipalities, lenders for services, landlords move to evict, mortgages might be unable to be unpaid on the building side, lenders won't lend, and that itself can become a cycle of really economic concern that can be very concentrated, similar to the way that in 2008 communities specifically were impacted. This is impacting communities where there is concentrations of industry and housing typology as well. Some of the statistics are really daunting, and some of them have changed since the summer and fall. One of them, which hasn't, is really the death rate, right? We're still seeing at this point 2,000 dead people plus a day, and the economy is really trying, in spite of that, to go back to normal. And we are seeing the stresses of that economically, from a health perspective, and in the housing market, all simultaneously. Low-income households are specifically more likely to be employed in the service sector and other sectors that have been taking the most direct hit from either job losses or jobs where people are not able to show up, right? So this is in-person work that generally cannot be done at home. Food, accommodations, construction work, entertainment, retail, and other service work, hospitals. These people are on the front lines, are already low paid, and so if they are not able to go to work, that starts to ripple through the economic waterfall.
Yeah, and I think that that's a key point, Matthew, that it is a waterfall effect, which is what this graphic is trying to show. And we could see all of these statistics on the left side about how heavy the impact is on lower and more vulnerable communities. And we know that there's a lot of money that all of you working out there in states, municipalities are taking in and having to design for. And so we know that that's a constraint as well. And so we want to make sure that you have your options here with the housing pieces at least. This particular slide here is housing stability risk. So it really shows in a snapshot how the loss of income can affect housing stability. This graphic will be available for you to take a closer look, but it's a really interesting graphic for those of you that are working in the variety of housing programs at the municipal level, especially. So with that, can we go to the next slide, please, Matthew? Here are some quick resources. Again, we don't expect you to go through and click through right now. They will be available and the links will be live when you get the PowerPoint on the HUD Exchange, but there's a lot of really good data out there if you haven't seen it already. Next slide. Now I wanted to hand it over briefly to Matthew Josephs. The reason that we wanted to share this part of the presentation with you is because we acknowledge that Cdbg and Cdbg CV alone aren't going to cover all the housing related development costs that you will face in the different types of programming. So we thought it would be important for you at least to be aware of the latest information about the housing provisions in ARPA. So Matt, can you take it away?
I can, and thank you, Madeline. And yeah, I'll try to go through these relatively quickly. I know we're trying to make up for some lost time to the technical difficulties, and again, we apologize for that. So if you want to go to the next slide, Matt L. Yeah, so we're going to cover a couple of the key funding sources that were made available subsequent to the CARES Act, which are really in play right now. So these came through the American Rescue Plan, which was signed on March 11th, provided close to $2 trillion worth of funding, program changes and tax provisions to aid in recovery from the pandemic. And it really included most of the affordable housing and community development resources to date of any of the COVID legislation. And the two key things we're going to talk about are additional funding that was made available through the HOME program, as well as through what's called the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds, which is a large pot of money, very flexible uses, including for affordable housing development. So next slide, Matt. So the home dollars, there was $5 billion of additional funding made available for home, and the funding has been distributed to the states and localities. It was done through the formula for PJs. 651 PJs qualified for the funding. It's targeted to high needs populations, including homeless and people at risk of the homelessness, and can be used for rental assistance, supportive services, development subsidies. It's really flexible. I'd refer folks that are really interested in learning more about how the funds can be used to CPD Notice 2110, and where you can see in this one document where the suspensions and waivers are included, all the ARP requirements. And it's important to note these funds are available through September of 2030. So there's a long ramp up for using the funding. Next slide. Some of the key suspensions, waivers, the match requirement, typically 25% has been waived. The investments in CHODOs, there's a set aside typically of 15% for CHODOs. That's now 10%. And there's actually more flexibility in that 5% can be used for administration for the CHODOs or for other nonprofits. So there's a more flexible definition around CHODOs and nonprofits. Also, 5% of the funds can be used for capacity building for the CHODOs or nonprofits. So that's a space worth exploring, I would think. There's a maximum per unit subsidy limit, and there's a commitment deadline of the 24 months. Another key feature, there's increased administrative and planning set-asides for the PJs. It's now up to 15%. I think that's typically 10%. And then they provided HUD with authority to suspend home and McKinney Act waivers, and HUD has used the waivers and alternative requirement authorities to create supportive services and non-congregate shelter programs, and to alter rental housing and tenant-based rental assistance program requirements. So a lot of flexibilities. Again, I'd encourage you to look at the CPD notice. Next slide, please. The home ARP funds must be used to benefit individuals and families that meet requirements for one or more qualifying populations. And again, those are the more distressed populations we talked about earlier. The PJs may use the home ARP money for a variety of eligible activities. That's affordable rental housing, tenant-based rental assistance is eligible, supportive services, and non-congregate shelters. We also have a link here to the ARP HUD Exchange webpage for additional information. Other critical housing resources provided in the ARPA include, of course, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, ERAP, that provided initially $25 billion was provided in December of 2020, but then ARPA increased that funding by $21 billion. So now you have about $46 billion of funding for emergency rental assistance. This can be used to provide financial assistance, including both backwards and forward rent payments, utility payments, other housing expenses, including supportive services. The funding has been fully allocated to the municipalities under this program, and to the degree which Treasury was also reallocating some funds for areas of higher need from states that didn't need as much of the resources. So that's been happening over the last couple months. Another big piece of funding was $5 billion in emergency housing choice vouchers. Those were provided via formula to the high need PHAs, and 70,000 rental assistance vouchers have been made available already to those municipalities. On the homeownership side, there was also a large investment, close to $10 billion for a homeowner assistance fund. So this is to keep families from losing their homes. This was being administered through mostly the housing finance agencies in the states. It can be used for a wide variety of homeownership supports, including mortgage, utility, and utility assistance, housing counseling, et cetera. So Treasury, these are in the process. The states have submitted plans to the Treasury Department for using the money. And Treasury is approving these plans, and we have a link to the website if you want to get an up-to-date of what's happening in your state with this funding sources. Finally, and certainly last but certainly not least, state and local fiscal recovery funds, $350 billion provided to the states and municipalities via formula administered by the Treasury Department for a wide variety of support to the states. It was generally, it's been being distributed in 2 tranches, 50% delivered from 60 days of enactment. So that went out last spring, and the other 50% to be delivered in a few months later this spring. It can be used very broadly, but it can include funding for affordable housing development services and assistance at the discretion of the state or municipality. We have a link to show you examples of how states and localities are utilizing funds for housing purposes. The final rule was recently issued by the Treasury, provides additional information on how funding can be used specifically for housing purposes. Examples include emergency housing assistance, affordable housing development, preservation and rehab, and permanent supportive housing. They can be provided to impacted households and communities. The eligible housing uses are generally aligned with home and National Housing Trust Fund programs so that they work well in tandem with those programs. I won't delve into this chart, but basically this shows the formula for how the funds have been distributed or will shortly be distributed for that second 50% of funding to the various states and counties and municipalities. Lastly, it's worth noting there are still efforts in place for forbearance and foreclosure protections and eviction protections for homeowners. Forbearance, basically any mortgage that is being backed by FHA, VA, USDA, Fannie and Freddie. So that's most mortgages in the country. You're entitled, owners are entitled to forbearance. They aren't forgiven on anything, but they are entitled to forbearance. The CFPB's website has, which we have a link to, has more information about that. And the eviction preventions, there were federal eviction preventions in place, but those were lifted back in August by the Supreme Court. So most states and even localities have their own rules around preventing evictions. And again, we have information in the link if you want to learn more about what might be happening in your state or municipality. That's it for my update, I think, Madeline.
Thanks, Matt. So this is an opportunity for those of you out there to put in the chat function any questions you may have. We can't promise that we'll get to everything, but we'll definitely put a pin in it and get back to you when we post the materials after this conference. So with that, please put your questions or comments in the chat, and we'll have a little discussion here. Any questions that have come in, Olivia or Stefan? Or I mean, Elizabeth, excuse me, or Stefan?
I have not seen any questions. This is Elizabeth from support, and I am monitoring both the chat and the Q&A in the Slido section below the video.
All right. Well, given the time, then we'll thank Matt Josephs for giving us the update. And Matt will let you know if there are any questions that do come in for you, and we'll connect with you after. So thank you very much, Matt, for participating this morning.
All right, thank you all.
Pause one moment. There is a chat now in the Brand Live chat, and I will put it into the Zoom if you cannot see it there yourself, okay. Mr. Joe.
Can the ARPA funding be used for a revolving loan program to develop affordable housing?
I'm fairly certain it can be, but I would encourage you to double check the notices and the final rules that HUD put out. But my understanding is what it could be. I mean, it can be done that way for Cdbg, so I think it similarly can be done under the ARPA.
And we can confirm.
Yeah, we can probably follow up if we get the name. It looks like from James on that one.
And I would also encourage, our very specific questions around some of this could also be asked to the AAQ that is up and running now for ARPA.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. There is an AAQ available through the HUD Exchange to answer some of these questions. So please feel free to add those questions there, but we'll put a pin in that and confirm and put in the follow-up materials. Another question is is HUD in the market for buying a real estate technology solution that could enable more affordable home buying, selling, and financing solution, actually more attainable?
That I
So,
don't know. Yeah,
yeah.
I was gonna say I would defer to somebody that might know what the HUD's up to on that front.
I guess that the question is a little unclear, but if I'm understanding it correctly, if there's some kind of a technology solution where there could be more of an exchange of information and of resources for home buying, selling, and financing. And there are some tools that are being created out there, but I think it's more and the individual kind of program level and how you design your program.
I don't know if I'm reading this correctly, Madeline, but they may be talking about something like the National Community Stabilization Trust that came out of the NSP program, for example. I don't know of anything new around that type of thing that is being proposed at this point in time, but we will definitely do a little bit more checking on that.
I would just add to that in terms of tying housing requirements to CV requirements. I would say, a safe place to always start as a baseline would be your HQS, your HUD HQS standards, and then build out from there.
And there's also going to be a lot of discussion around tiebacks for CV requirements. We'll touch a little bit on it in the housing model here, but also in the basically Cdbg on day 3, we're going to be doing a session on housing and real properties for Cdbg, so we could touch on it there as well. So I encourage you to go to that session. In the interest of time, we're going to move on to the next portion of our presentation, which delves into the housing models. Thanks, Matt. And we'll follow up if needed.
Okay, thank you all.
Thanks. So for the housing models, we wanted to level set the conversation a little bit, and this is where I'm going to turn it over to Michael to really pose some, and the next slide, please, Stefan. To pose some of the kind of baseline important questions before diving in. So Michael, do you want to take it away?
Thank you, Madeline. As the poll revealed in a few slides earlier ago, that there's over 50% of you are coming from municipal and county government. So you're the closest to deal execution and to kind of touching the actual housing markets in your communities. So to that end, right, you want to build a plan and work with the development community in a way that really mirrors the data, that responds to actual data, and not build a plan based on presumptions of what's needed. So make sure that you approach all your work with an orientation to data, which is readily accessible to you through the internet and through a variety of services and platforms offered by the federal government. To start, what's the distribution of home ownership and rental in your community by percentage and by actual numbers? As we know, generally speaking, as an aggregate in the United States, we have approximately a 60-40 split between home ownership and rental. But in your communities, particularly in cities, that ratio ends up becoming typically more weighted towards rental versus home ownership. Having that data and having an understanding and having some texture and color around that is really important for you to devise a plan. And you'll be able to understand needs and who's in crisis, what exactly is where should you concentrate your resources. Secondly, what are the rents or multifamily rental in your community by bedroom type, by bedroom type? How do you get that access to that data? Like, what are the rents in your central business district, for instance? So, that information could be obtained from if you have relationships with an appraiser or other developers in your community. So, or, a variety of other kind of online platform searches to kind of give you some anecdotal data. Anything less than a market study may just be somewhat anecdotal, but it's still meaningful for you to understand where the markets are sitting in your community, or where the market rents, both for in the communities, in the outside of the communities, and neighboring neighborhoods and central business district. So fundamental for you to understanding and devising a housing plan, of course, is, what are the income limits that are in your community? HUD sets rents by income and by the 30% rent to income ratio. So and it sets income. Incomes start with a family of 4. So understanding that, committing that to memory is really important, and kind of playing with the math as bedroom sizes change and rents. So you should have a real command of that data for you to kind of develop a plan. Similarly, you should really know the affordable rents, what an affordable rent would be in your community at 60% of the area median income and at 80%. That data is found on a variety of commercial websites and also provided to you through HUD user, which is a readily available website that you could locate these rents online. What's the vacancy rate in your community? What we're experiencing across the country is we're experiencing historically low vacancy rates in our rental markets all across the country. But you should have a command. You should know that data, because that's going to help you to inform your decision about what kind of housing plan you're going to build. And lastly, just what are the median sales prices for a homeowner unit in your community? That's a little bit more anecdotal and a little bit more improvisational in terms of kind of finding that kind of data, but take a look at a variety of commercial websites that are available to kind of obtain this information. Zillow, Realtor.com, there's certainly no shortage of real estate data available for you to just kind of get a sense of where these data points land. And again, I think it's essential for you to have a command of this information for you to develop a plan that's meaningful and responsive to the needs of your community. I'll turn it over to you, Madeline.
Thanks, Michael. So I think these questions are really important for everyone, and especially important for those of you that are just starting out. And we saw in our poll earlier that there are folks that are just getting their feet wet in affordable housing in your communities. So commit these kind of tips to memory, because it is really important to have that data-driven approach to your housing program design. So next slide, please. So I wanted to go over the housing models guide. All this presentation is based on a guide, a written guide that will come out later this year. And you will have much more in-depth information on every single one of these models through that guide. For today's purposes, we're going to do a high-level overview of each model and try to connect them to CV as much as we can and as much as is appropriate. We will be dividing the conversation into short-term and long-term, and then rental and owner. So for this morning, we're going to focus on the short-term models, those models that address the more immediate needs at least, and then the longer-term housing models will come this afternoon. Next slide. We also want to go over capital stacks. Now, this is with the understanding that Cdbg or Cdbg CV won't be the only source in a lot of the projects, the housing projects that you're going to be carrying out in your community. So for each of the housing models where appropriate, we're going to talk about the capital stacks and really giving you models for those capital stacks so that you understand the different funding sources that come into those kinds of projects. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Doug Harsney, who will begin to talk to us about Cdbg and housing models. Next slide.
Yes, good morning, everybody. It's exciting to be here with you today, and I want to apologize in advance if I go into a bit of a coughing spell. I am recovering from COVID myself, and I'll try not to give that to you through your monitor today. But Cdbg for housing is where we would like to start this discussion, because after all, This conference is centered around CDBG, CV, and we want to make sure that we're thinking about how we can best use that resource within the context of all the other resources that Matt talked about, for example, as we go forward here. So if we go all the way back to the beginning of CDBG in the early 70s, when Jim Broman was sitting in his HUD office and developing this program on his typewriter, as he sat there in his bell-bottom jeans, you know, he probably wasn't thinking about how do we make affordable housing specifically, because CDBG was really devised to be very broad in its intent, to think about making it as flexible as possible for local governments to do the kinds of things that they needed to do to address the challenges that they had in their local communities. And with that in mind, that's one of the things that's made CDBG very popular over the years across the political spectrum, is this local control, the flexibility that's built into the program. As a part of that, though, it can be a little bit more difficult in some ways to use CDBG for some types of housing. You know, and one of the challenges, of course, is it comes with a number of what we call cross-cutting requirements. Things like environmental review and uniform relocation, Section 3, Davis-Bacon, fair housing, and well, you get the idea. There's a lot of other things that you have to think about as you go forward using these CDBG dollars. I should also mention, you know, a program that was not around at the time that CDBG was developed, but that came along not too long after that, was the HOME program. And HOME was designed very much specifically for housing. And HOME has some differences between it and the CDBG program. And we don't have time to go into all of those today, but you know, the way that subsidies are calculated, and the question of an affordability period, and whether or not there are housing standards that must be complied with, those kinds of things differ between those programs. And yet, even though HOME is designed specifically for housing, it leaves some gaps that are difficult to fill that can sometimes better be filled by CDBG. And I'll give you an example. Because CDBG does not require a set of comprehensive standards, that, in other words, the house doesn't have to be brought up to a certain level across the spectrum of different areas of need within that home, you know, the various mechanical systems and so on. You can go in and do one or two things through a home repair under CDBG, and you cannot do that in HOME. And that makes it a very good program for doing home repairs, where you need to just go in and fix a furnace or maybe fix a roof so that you're stabilizing that unit. So there can be some advantages. In addition, CDBG can also sometimes fill gaps that you might not think about. I think back to a project that I had some involvement with the city of Clearwater, Florida. They were using a variety of dollars to try to do a project, but they still had a gap in funding, and it was new construction, which, by the way, you can't do with normal CDBG dollars. And yet they were able to go in and acquire the property upon which that housing would eventually sit, using those CDBG dollars. And so using these kinds of creative approaches, sometimes we can do things or combine things in ways that make those possible. Next slide, please. I want to come back to what we heard from both Michael and from Madeline in terms of data, but even more specifically, or more basically, if you will, what we're really needing to think about is what is the need in your community, and what is the best way to fill that need. And in this matrix that we've put together, we've tried to divide that up, and I know it's a little difficult for some of you to see, but we've tried to divide that up so that it shows short-term rental needs, short-term homeowner needs, long-term rental needs, and long-term homeowner needs. And that's just one way to think about it. But the important thing is that you need to be thinking about what are the basic needs that we're trying to fill within our community. Who's needing housing? Is it somebody who's actually homeless? Is it a homeowner who has maybe basic needs that are unmet? Maybe they don't have heat, or they don't have running water. There are different kinds of needs that we're trying to fill. In addition, as we already mentioned a few times through this program, we're trying to tie this back to COVID. And COVID has different, the response to COVID is different depending on what it is about COVID that you're trying to respond to. So for example, we could be referring to something that's trying to prepare for a crisis. You know, we could be trying to prevent the crisis. We could be trying to respond to it in a more long-term way, or we could even be seeking to sustain our housing over that longer term. So those can be very different kinds of things and have very different ways of approaching our response to COVID or our COVID tieback. So we'll touch on that as we go through the various housing models. Next slide, please. So the first housing model that we want to talk about, and we're going to go through the short-term housing models in this slide deck. As we get into the part 2 of this, after we take a little break, we'll do the long-term housing models. But in this first housing model, we're going to focus on short-term rental, emergency rental assistance. And as we've already mentioned, there are multiple ways or multiple sources of funding that can be used for this. Matt did a good job of talking about some of those other funds, such as ESG and the funds at Treasury. And also, as you know, there are some waivers that came out around the CARES Act that apply to some of the different models that we're going to cover. So you want to keep those in mind as well as we go along. But regarding the use of funds for emergency assistance, I should also mention that there's a whole session on that. If you want to do a deeper dive on it, there's a whole session tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. And you should look at that if you're interested in doing a deeper dive on that specific model. But I'm going to cover a couple of areas just very quickly, because this one is something that's being used a lot. And what I want to go into is just some of the details around how this can be used. And Cdbg, by the way, has been able to be used for emergency assistance, you know, before COVID. So that's not new. And what you could normally do in Cdbg is provide up to 3 months of assistance. And by the way, even though we have this listed as a short-term rental strategy, it can also apply to utilities, and it can apply to mortgage assistance. So it could also be a homeowner strategy. So we want you to keep that in mind as well. Getting into a few details here, grantees can fund up to 6 months under the COVID, the Cdbg CV requirements, which also can apply to the 2019 and 2020 Cdbg dollars. Under that COVID assistance, we can go up to 6 months in providing assistance to folks that are in need. And those households that are in need, you may also cover in that first month of assistance some arrears. So they might be starting out coming to you 3 months behind. So in that first month of assistance, you might actually be providing 4 months of assistance because you're covering their arrearage period. And then from that point on, you can go forward and cover up to a full 6 months of assistance. I must mention that you cannot have a gap in that assistance. There's no break that you can make in that assistance, or you can't go back in and help them again. It's got to be consecutive. In addition, I want to mention that you have to consider duplication of benefits. So if there are other forms of assistance that are available to that household, once you've looked at all of those available sources, then you're going to make a decision in terms of whether you can help that household. And I should also mention that you can help households that are assisted with Section 8, but only for the portion of rents and utilities for which the tenants are actually responsible. Another thing that I want you to think about is that after the first 100 days, it's required that you follow the lead safe housing rule requirements, and that will require an inspection and then a determination of whether there are lead-based paint hazards that need to be addressed. And by the way, Cdbg dollars, for Cdbg dollars, that's an eligible expense to repairs for lead-based paint hazards. And in fact, there's a COVID tie back to that because it's a respiratory issue.
Doug, there was a question about the 6 month, excuse me, and the 4 month example that you gave for arrearages. Someone asked, is that a total of 10 months?
It's not a total of 10 months because you can pay arrearages in addition as part of that first month's payment. So there's nothing sacred about the 3 months. I just threw that out there. People could be 4 months in arrearages or 2 months. But that first month, you can pay some arrearages that they have, and you should have local policies about how much you pay for. That's something that should be built into your program and thought about as you develop that. Because obviously you have a limited source of funds, so you have to determine how much are we going to assist one specific household, knowing that we have a lot of other households who are also in need.
So Doug, just one quick follow-up. The 6 month is the 6 month duration of assistance based on someone's rent. Is that right? Cumulatively,
it could be based on their rents, or it could be utility assistance or mortgage assistance. Yes. In addition, when you're doing mortgage assistance, you should give some thought to, is this going to be sustainable for that homeowner long term? Are they going to get to a point by us providing this help where they're going to be able to pick up those payments again and save that house? Because that also might play into whether it makes sense to assist them, given the limited nature of the funds that we have. I also want to mention that grantees cannot make payments to themselves, such as, you can't pay the property taxes that are coming back to the community that's giving the funds, or the utilities that are coming back to that same community. As far as utilities, there have been some questions about what kinds of utilities can get assistance. And, I should mention that HUD's tried to be flexible with this program, as you can hear by some of the things that we've already said. They do not, cell phones are a no. Landlines, on the other hand, can be a yes, along with, some of your more basic utilities, such as electricity and water and such. I'm gonna go to the next slide, please. And it looks like we might have some questions. Madeline, do you want to guide us on that a little bit?
Yeah, one of the questions that came in is just a clarification on arrearages again. I think because this program is one that's being used often for the Cdbg CV housing model, someone asked, the first month can pay all of their arrearages?
It can, But again, the community should have a policy about how much in total they'll pay for a specific household.
And then we have another question. The CERA program is willing to cover a total of 15 months. So is the CDBG not part of the CERA funding?
It's not part of the ERA funding, but it is again, you have to look at that duplication of benefits as you're making these decisions.
There's also another question on the lead paint inspections, if they're required for rental or mortgage assistance.
They are required if you're going to go over 100 days and providing assistance, yes.
Thanks, Doug. I think we should go to the next housing model. In the interest of time, you know, we had a little bit more material in here to go over. But just to give you guys a chance out there to participate a little bit, let's review a little bit. Which of the following can CDBG funds be used for? Construction costs for an adaptive reusable warehouse into permanent supportive housing units, acquisition of property for multifamily housing, architectural and engineering fees for an affordable housing project, services offered to tenants, or all of the above. So which do you think? And Doug will share the correct answer with us in a second here.
I assume that someone on our support team will pull up the responses.
Yes, that will be Kevin. And it looks like the all of the above is cut off because of the size of the screen.
It looks like most people think it's all, the answer is all of the above. And you would be correct. And this goes back to what we were talking about the broad scope of CDBG and how it's was designed from its inception to be able to be used for a lot of different kinds of uses. That being said, it may have some challenges for some of those uses, so you have to take a closer look at that. Let's go to the next slide.
So we're now on the short-term rental non-congregate housing, SRO.
Okay. So again, this is another use that some people have, some grantees out there have been able to really make a big difference for particularly their homeless population through this model. And it can take a number of forms, but the basic concept here is we have a lot of people that maybe were in shelters previously where they were all together in one space. And of course, for COVID, that was not something that worked out well. And so the goal was to try to create separate spaces where folks could live. And this has some benefits anyways, as we understand, you know, that housing is a basic human need, and there's something inherently helpful to folks about having their own space. And so this is something that I think we can learn a lot of lessons from as we take a closer look at it. And one of the things that I wanted to touch on is, give me just 1 second here. My notes aren't lining up. There we go. One of the things that I wanted to touch on is that this can be done in a variety of ways. One of the things that we're seeing folks do is to take a hotel and, you know, do a contract with that hotel to make that possible to be used for housing. And, you know, that's in some cases been pretty successful. In other cases, it's had some challenges. And so that's something that needs to be thought about. There are some best practices around this that I think are worth thinking about. One of the things that they've discovered is that you really have to have some good services overlaying this, and you really need to have on-site staff 24/7 to provide case management. You also need to have, in whatever form this takes, designated personal space, that being one household per room and bath. So if you're just putting, if you have hotel rooms, but you're putting people from multiple households in one room, that turned out to be problematic. You need to have good security procedures designed to keep guests safe. You need to have consistent access to food. They discovered that you need good storage of personal belongings and increased time and autonomy associated with that 24/7 access to that facility. So those are just some things that have come out of early research that's been done as people have tried this, that they found are really best practices for this. Another form that this has taken, and this is also under the innovative approaches, is the concept of doing tiny homes. And, you know, the success of that seems to be tied to similar kinds of things. In addition, though, some of the tiny houses actually don't have good facilities for bathrooms. You know, maybe they don't have plumbed water in them, or you know, but you have to then think about, how are we going to provide for that need? You know, are we going to have congregate bathrooms? How's that going to look and work? So there's a lot to think about as you begin to delve into some of these approaches.
And Doug, it seems to me that this is a point where we can encourage folks to really look at various stakeholders and who the community is out there that's already doing some of this work with maybe the homeless population, looking to the COCs and looking to see how this can interplay with the ESG programs, for example. So there is that communications aspect, I think, to all of this work that is important. And we do have a couple of questions that came in. So maybe if we go to the next slide, we can have a little bit of a discussion.
And while you're going there, Madeline, I just wanted to mention too, there are some good, as you mentioned, case studies. There's some good resources that we could send you links to that might be helpful if you really want to focus on this or learn more about it.
Thanks, Doug. That's really important. If there are some resources you want to learn more about, please ask in the chat for more information and we'll compile them. So we had a couple of questions. One was I know that there's a lag between Brand Live and Zoom, but to clarify that I hear that grantees should have a policy stating a maximum amount that they will pay a single household's arrearage. So we're going back a couple of models.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yes, I would agree with that, yes.
And then the next question was, could the funds be used for a lease to buy type of implementation, which would allow for a new affordable housing strategy?
Lease to buy implementation. I have not seen that done using these dollars. I don't know if others on the panel want to speak to that.
Rent to own is a common theme that is coming up across all the geographies that we work in. I don't know if it has been specifically addressed via this specific capital funding source, but I will say, you know, so let's put a pin in solving for that. All of the additional or any of the additional funding sources you're layering underneath this would also have to come into play as well. Subsidy layering in general is something that is really, really important when considering how you're going to be assembling the capital stacks for these. So we can try and see if we can talk to our policy people and get you some specific guidance on that. But I will just say you're not alone in thinking that rent to own is is a model that should be considered. We're seeing it in every market we're in.
So, yeah, go ahead, Doug.
Madeline.
No, I was just going to say that there is a question here that I think comes up quite a bit in terms of HVAC systems and the tieback. So do you want to touch a little bit on that?
You're talking about the
Upgrades to HVAC systems as a tieback.
I'm sorry, I'm not seeing that question, but HVAC systems would be tied back in the effect that it is addressing respiratory concerns within the home. So those are generally allowed for that reason. Anything that's going to address potential respiratory irritants within the home, such as HVAC systems, addressing lead-based paint, mold, other air quality issues, those are generally good tiebacks to the program. I was noting here where we were just talking about SROs, and there's a question here about SROs having to have their own bath, or are congregate baths allowed? And I think it's important to note that there are, particularly if you're developing housing that's going to be single room occupancy, you have to know what the local zoning requirements are, and you have to work within the framework that's allowable within your jurisdiction. So there, this is something that requires some research and understanding about what you can and cannot do. That's one of the reasons that these are done as short-term, using facilities that already exist, such as hotels, for example.
Thanks, Doug. I think in the interest of time, we'll move to the next housing model. And I think this goes to Michael. There are a couple of housing models here that are particularly of interest out there. Repurpose hotels, and certainly legal services are for eviction prevention is something that folks have been interested in. But Michael, do you want to?
I think this one's still me, actually.
Oh, is it? Okay, thanks, Doug.
So we already talked about repurposed hotels. We talked about tiny houses just a little bit. There are, once again, on the tiny houses, there are a number of places where they've tried this in a variety of different ways, and the models are vastly different in their approach and what's actually worked. But I think there are some real lessons that can be learned as you look at those models, and not just trying to jump in and do something without studying what others have already tried ahead of you. But I do want to touch on services. Remember that one of the things that's happened in COVID is the service cap has been lifted, and both as a rental strategy and as an owner strategy, legal services for eviction prevention or foreclosure prevention is something that I think is worth a look for many of us, because obviously that's something that is a need that we're seeing out there in many jurisdictions. I guess next slide. Do we have any? Further discussion about that?
I will note that for the repurposed hotels, there are models for and case studies around them, so we can certainly get that information out as well. There are folks that have kind of worked through the capital stack of a project like that. So if you're interested, we certainly can put some more information out there. And you will certainly find a lot more information about all of these models in the housing guide when it's released. And Doug, there seems to be a lot of interest in SROs. So we'll gather some information for folks and put it out there for that.
Sure. It's definitely interesting, and it definitely meets a need and offers value, but there have also been some challenges with it along the way. And there's a long history going back to the 19th century where, and probably before that, where folks have tried this, and it's served a purpose, but it's also presented some challenges. So it's something that should be studied carefully as you seek to implement it.
The next slide is a poll. Can we go to that? Which can be a short-term housing solution for addressing the immediate needs of a homeless veteran? A, owner-occupied home rehab, foreclosure counseling, tiny houses, all of the above. Doug, do you want to go over the responses?
Yeah, I'm just watching them go back and forth seesawing. It's kind of interesting. Actually, the answer that we thought was the right answer is tiny houses, because owner-occupied rehab, if a person has a house, they're technically not homeless. So that probably wouldn't be the best bet. In foreclosure counseling, the same. The assumption is if there's a potential for foreclosure that they do have a home at that point in time. This is homeless prevention. If you're addressing those things, those are important for that purpose. But if they're already homeless, they're probably not in possession of a home. And next slide. And I think this one's Matt.
Thank you, Doug. So just a quick overview of what we consider short-term owner-occupied home repair. A home repair program that is run by a municipality can reach folks on a spectrum of income from very low all the way to what the subsidy source being used would allow, which would be in this case, I believe 80% AMI. Doug, please disabuse me of that if I'm incorrect. The realities of this program is that it helps folks that have a home already, right? So if you look to the right of the slide, we have kind of a representation of what is needed in order to pull off a successful home repair program. Owner capital essentially is the match that a homeowner is going to have to put into the project. That dollar amount is going to enable that homeowner to access a pot of capital that is coming from a variety of sources, right? In this case, based on the dollar amount that may be coming into your community, you may be able to do a home repair program without the complexities of this capital stack. But for illustration's sake, in order to, let's say, reach somebody at 40 or 50% AMI and have that person be able to pay back that loan, you are going to have to underwrite that person's income. And in order to reach folks at the lower spectrum of the income scale, you will have to either relax the terms of the payments, or you will have to seek another source of funds that has a lower payment threshold than yours to blend, or hopefully a philanthropic source of capital that can possibly not be repaid, that can even further deepen the income targeting of your home repair fund. If you are able to come up with a group of capital funders, public sector, private sector, philanthropy, you may be able to have a larger impact by going out to your local banks and doing what's called leveraging, borrowing against that those contributions, committed contributions, in order to take, let's say, a $20 million program to a $50 or $60 million program and be able to reach more constituents. There are a couple
I'd just like
things
to add, just as a plug, Local Initiative Support Corporation has stood up a very successful program in our Detroit market, a home repair program leveraging private debt and municipal Cdbg funds. And we've reached over 600 homeowners since we stood up this program. If anybody interested in learning more about this program, we'd be happy to communicate to you offline.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, absolutely. And as to the type of things that will allow a home repair fund to be successful, a motivated government and an aligned philanthropic sector and flexible underwriting standards are really important. Even more important is a roster of vetted and approved contractors that know how to interact with a municipality and its funding requirements. You have to be able to reach the homeowners that are currently living in your municipality. So you have to build the fund for the people that are there, not the fund that you want or that is the most convenient and easiest to put together, and then ongoing support and a pipeline that will keep the program cycling through, will keep funders motivated, and will keep constituents happy. Next slide.
I just wanted to jump in for just a minute, Matthew. A couple of things that I think are best practices as well for local communities wanting to do this is to think about this a little bit differently than you do your owner-occupied rehab, for example, because you're typically in home repair, you're dealing with one or two systems in the house. You're not trying to bring the whole house up to standards, as we talked about earlier. And with that, you're also able oftentimes to do lower income households than you might in some of your other programs. So because this is addressing lower income households, you have to be careful about how you fund this. And because you can do it all day long, because there's such a need in our communities, those creative ways that Matthew and Michael were talking about are really important to think about as well.
And Doug, let me add to that and just really kind of double down on how this relates to COVID and kind of the social determinants of health and the tieback. Really, one of the challenges, especially for legacy cities, I don't want to say the Rust Belt term that is used, but in older cities with very older housing stocks, one of the real challenges is that asbestos and lead remediation can eat up, let's say the entire amount of a prospective home repair loan. Those imminent needs and going beyond those imminent needs can sometimes really be hampered just by either code issues or like I said, lead and asbestos. So growing that pot of funds, especially if you don't have 50 or $60 million to allocate to this particular project, leveraging your funds, especially with philanthropic dollars that don't necessarily have to be repaid, will allow you to get to your homeowners issues beyond, let's say, lead and asbestos. Once you're in there, you can't go beyond that generally until you address those two things. And that sometimes can exhaust what an income can pay for in terms of loan size. So any kind of non-repayable funds that you can get into that capital stack to either lower the payment or defer payment will really make a difference into the type of folks that you can target. So food for thought. I just touched on some of these things. Major challenges above lead and asbestos, municipal arrears, water bills, delinquent taxes, code violations. Clear title is an issue, especially in properties, what we call heirs properties, properties that have been passed down and that have not necessarily had title move through probate all the way, or have some sort of issue, can make getting dollars into those houses challenging. A technical assistance environment that can really go deep with those homeowners, either to get them situated where they're eligible for this funding source, or eligible for another funding source, and really get to the heart of the issues that preclude them from moving forward, is really important, both for folks that get not approved for credit issues, but also for the things I just mentioned. Construction monitoring, quality control, super important, especially when you're dealing with constituents' houses. And then I mentioned leveraged already, so we can go to the next.
Matthew, a question came in on home repair, asking whether we have to do SHPO review and environmental reviews still. And it might be a Doug question too.
Doug, do you want to take a stab?
Yeah, you would have a tiered review process, much like what you would have for your rehab programs, for example.
I don't think single family houses go through the same type of seeker and SHPO reviews as multifamily homes, but there's also jurisdiction by jurisdiction overlays, especially if you're in a landmark preservation district or something like that, right? So those are things to also be mindful of.
And we have one more housing model to go over before our break. We will be starting the second session at 11:15. We'll be taking a break here in a couple of minutes. So really quickly, wanted to go over this last housing model, the last poll, and then we'll break.
Yeah, so just really the only thing I want to cover here is, given that the idea of doing legal services can be really beneficial if it's done well. And I have seen this work really well. I want to give you an example. When I worked for the state of Ohio, we did this where we had a hotline that was statewide that people could call into that were in danger of foreclosure. And people could call into this hotline and we would send them to counselors and or attorneys in their area that could help them by providing assistance with foreclosure counseling or legal assistance to sort of put them into some sort of forbearance situation or some other way, help them to work that out. And that was very effective. And it's, I think, a good a good thing to think about if you have folks that are in that situation within your community. Madeline?
Great, let's move on to the next slide then. I see that there are a couple of questions coming in. There was definitely a lot of interest in the SRO. Someone asked if there are any specific tiny house projects that have been funded with Cdbg. I know that tiny house is rather, an interesting discussion, and there are various opinions on it, but we could certainly get you some more resources on that. And then in terms of the housing models for part 2, maybe it's time to kind of move on here because we are at 11 o'clock. So Stefan, if you could go to the next slide. We just wanted to do this afternoon's sessions. So this afternoon, we will be talking about the housing models for long-term solutions. So we're going to be talking about permanent supportive housing, rental rehab, scattered site rental, new multifamily housing, including mixed income and mixed use, and then the innovative and supporting housing models, including adaptive reuse and accessory dwelling units. That's on the rental side. And then on the owner side, we'll look at owner rehab, acquisition, rehab, resale, new single family, and innovative and supporting housing models, including community land trusts as an example. So we will have those housing models coming up this afternoon. We would appreciate it if you all go to, you could log off here and then come back on at 11:15 for that afternoon session. That we will have the full 2 hours, so we won't have to be as rushed to get through all of the material. So we look forward to seeing you back here at 11:15 for the long-term housing solutions. And we'll talk to you all soon. Thank you.